Excellent. So tonight I'm going to introduce you to Tim Blackburn. He's Professor of Invasion Biology at the University College London. He's researched and published studies on invasions, as well as on a range of other topics, macroecology, extinction, and life history. Tonight he's going to talk to us about the jewel box, how moths illuminate nature's hidden rules. I'm going to hand over now to Tim.
Thank you. So the first challenge is to see if I can share my screen so that you can see my slides.
That's perfect.
Brilliant. And then, sorry, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay. So the second thing I need to do is to thank you all for coming, to apologize that we had to delay this. Unfortunately, the original scheduled date, I was hit by a rather nasty virus, but I'm very happy to see so many people have turned out for the rescheduling, despite the lovely sunny weather and also the lure of the football, although hopefully this will slot neatly in between this afternoon and this evening's games. So as Maria said, I want to talk to you, well, sort of basically through the medium of the jewel box. I want to do something that's quite ambitious, which is to try and explain how the natural world works. Now that, it turned out, was quite a challenge to do in an 80,000 word book. And it's turned out over the last year that it's been even more of a challenge to do in a sort of 45-minute talk. So what I generally do instead is try and give you a little bit of background to the jewel box, how it came to be in existence, what I'm trying to do with it, and then give you just a little flavor of how what we know about moths can help us to understand how this incredible world that we're part of sort of functions as understood by ecological scientists, at least. So the talk will fall into three parts. I'll give a little bit about the background, how I came to be interested in this particular group of organisms, then what I set out to try and achieve with the book, whether I did that or not is another matter, and then finally going through some of the sort of ways in which we understand the function of nature and the natural world. So I guess to get to this point, we can go back about 10 years, which is when I started working at UCL. And one of the things that UCL wanted me to do when I got there was to run their ecology field course. And that then took place at a Field Studies Council site up in Scotland called Kindrogan, a lovely old country house in the just south of the Cairngorms. Queen Victoria stayed there. A really nice place back in the 19th century, although has sort of fallen into disrepair, and now the FSC unfortunately can no longer accommodate people there, which is very sad. But that's where I started leading the field course, and one of the aims of that course is to take students and introduce them to elements of the natural world, and you know, I've always got a real kick out of showing people elements of biodiversity that they didn't know existed. But part of this field course, essentially, I got the kick given to me by some of the staff at the FSC, because the first year that I ran this course, they said, "Oh, you know, we've got a moth trap. Would you like us to run it?" And I mean, I said yes, because of course, why wouldn't you? But you know, when people think of moth traps, and if you Google moth trap, probably most of what you'll find as things like this. A sort of device for attracting and trapping this species, the common clothes moth, which is a bit of a nasty pest species in people's houses, eats their clothes and carpets and so on. But the moth trap that the FSC meant was a standard light trap like this. This is a Robinson trap. The FSC had one, and they ran it sort of that night, that day that they asked me if I wanted it run. And I was basically completely unprepared for the outcome of that night. And the next morning sort of went out to the trap actually sort of about an hour before I'd agreed to meet the students just to see what was there, and was completely blown away by this incredible, unexpected diversity of insects, all this incredible form and function and beauty of moths that had just been conjured as if by magic out of thin air. And that first night, or that first morning with the moth trap, basically just instilled a sort of a deep love in me for moths and these particular insects. And it was a bit frustrating, really, because you know, I would go up to Kindrogan for sort of a week and a bit a year, and then I would come back to London, and then I would spend the rest of the 12 months until the next field course, looking forward to going up and running the moth trap. And not being particularly fast on the uptake, it was probably about sort of 3 years before I suddenly realized that, well, actually, maybe I didn't have to wait until the field course at all. I could actually just get my own moth trap and run it myself. But of course, living in London, you don't really know, what you're going to find. I mean, it's a very different environment to the Highlands of Scotland. As you know, London is mainly concrete and brick. Those are not good media for growing insects. Also, this is the entirety of our outdoor space. We have a sort of an upstairs flat in Kentish Town. It's a small area. It's about 20 feet off the ground. Would anything come if I ran a moth trap there? I mean, it's not like the light of the moth trap is the strongest light in the vicinity. But nevertheless, I got my wife for my birthday about 6 or 7 years ago to buy me a moth trap, and I started running it. And incredibly, London has moths, and it has a quite surprising diversity of species. So these are all different animals that I've caught on my roof terrace here in London. And it was an unexpected joy. And basically, from that moment, I've run a moth trap any night that I possibly can. And, the surprises don't end with the species that, the book says ought to be in the area. So one night last year, I was sitting out on the roof terrace watching the moths come into the trap when I noticed this beast on the terrace door. I didn't recognize it, and it took me a fair bit of investigation to find that this is actually a jackfruit borer moth, and this is the first record of this moth wild or flying free in the UK, possibly anywhere in Europe. So, there are incredible surprises out there, and a moth trap is just an incredible joy. It really connects you with all this amazing, mysterious, hidden nature that surrounds us, but we never see. And so it was the moths then that sort of got me thinking about how the natural world works. And I guess, I've been a professional ecologist for 30 years now, and it's my job essentially to understand nature, understand the workings of nature. But the moth trap just got me thinking about it again, and it made me want to go back and try and explain from sort of very first principles how we actually understand the incredible diversity of nature. So the aim of the book, really, what I set out to do in writing it, was to try and communicate what the processes are that drive the fundamental diversity of life. And that is essentially the role of an ecologist. So ecology is the scientific study of the abundance and distribution of organisms. And what that means is we try and understand sort of how many individuals there are of different species, where those individuals live. And understanding that for an individual species, then you can layer it up, and that then helps you to understand why there are more species, and some areas have more species than others. And so these are the fundamental diversity processes. And that's actually a really challenging thing to try and do. So, ecologists often get a bad rap in science because ecology is not hugely predictive. And many ecologists suffer from what you might call physics envy. So, we're sort of envious of the incredible precision with which physicists can sort of predict and understand the world around us. But I would argue that physicists actually have it really easy. So, in the universe, there's only 17 fundamental particles in the standard standard physics model. There's 4 fundamental forces. Those particles make 118 different elements. So really, the diversity is not that great. Most of those particles and elements, every different atom in them is essentially identical. It's much, much more difficult for ecologists and for anyone trying to understand the natural world, nature, organisms with which we share the planet. So, we often think about species. I mean, we know we've named about 1.5 million species around the world. That's quite a lot, but actually, we don't know most species. We know that most species remain to be described by science. Exactly how many species there are really isn't really known. So you can find estimates of maybe 3 million to 100 million. Realistically, maybe about 8 million species of eukaryotes. So that's species with chromosomes in a nucleus like us. But then there's all those bacteria and their relatives, and we don't really even have a good estimate for how many of those there are. You can find people saying maybe there's only 10,000 species, maybe there's 1 trillion. We really don't know. And that's just the species. So each species is made up of individuals. And of course, there's many more individuals than there are species. So if we think about birds, which we know pretty relatively well, so we've got about 200 British breeding bird species. But within those, there's roughly 161 million breeding birds in the UK. So that's roughly sort of 2 breeding birds for every person in the UK. Worldwide, probably about 83 billion. We've got pretty good estimates. So roughly, 10 birds for each person worldwide. Birds are a group that we know quite well. They're quite big and easy to see. Insects, on the other hand, it's much harder to guess. I mean, I've seen estimates. There's an estimate on the Smithsonian website that there's a roughly 10 quadrillion individual insects, or roughly 100 million for every breeding bird in the world. The thing is, I don't even know, there's no evidence or there's no information on where that estimate comes from, and I don't even know what it means. Is that adult insects? Does it include everything from eggs, caterpillars, pupae, and so on? Just don't know. Clearly, though, there's a lot of insects out there. And that's just the sort of the bigger animals, as it were. For things like bacteria, there might be 1 billion bacteria in every gram of soil. And then we have the viruses. Again, you can find estimates out there from the Virology Society that there's like 10 nonillion viruses in the world. So that's 1 times 10 to the 31, 1 followed by 31 zeros. So that's roughly 1 billion viruses per insect. And also, if you lined up those viruses end to end, they would stretch out 100 million light years, which is pretty incredible. And of course, thanks to genetics, a lot of those individuals, if not most of them, are different from every other individual. Every species is different, and most individuals in most species are also different as well. So understanding all of that diversity is an incredible challenge. On top of that, no species lives in isolation, so all species interact with each other. And those interactions just multiply the complexity exponentially. So just in the UK, we have around 2,500 moth species. And what that means is that there's more possible communities of moth species, more possible combinations of moth species just in the UK than there are atoms in the entire universe. So it's an incredible complexity that we need to understand, which really begs the question, and not only that, but all of those numbers, they're sort of snapshot numbers. They're, what might be present at any given second. Life has been evolving and developing and changing on this planet for 126 quadrillion seconds, give or take. And every second, that diversity changes. Individuals are born, individuals die, species evolve and go extinct. Everything moves around. It's incredibly difficult to understand, very complicated. And so that now does beg the question of where do we even begin? Well, from my perspective, where I've thought we might as well begin is by looking at moths. So moths are an incredibly diverse group. Roughly 1 in 10 species, named species, is a moth. So around 140,000 species of moth worldwide. It should be 1 in 9 really, because I'm excluding 20,000 species of moth that fly around by day and that we colloquially call butterflies, but which really are just an unusual group of moths. So 1 in every 9 species is a moth. That means if we understand moths, or if we explore moths, we're actually sort of understanding a fair chunk of at least animal or higher, larger organism biodiversity. So they're an interesting group, potentially informative. And so what I wanted to try and do with the jewel box is basically show how, by paying attention to these moths, we can actually sort of start to understand a little bit about how the natural world works. But also that to understand the contents of a moth trap, you actually need to consider the entirety of the planet and the entirety of the evolution of life. So yes, something of a challenge. So that brings me to how I've actually sort of gone about trying to explain how the world works, which is the guts of this book. So I apologize to the people out attending this talk that actually know about moths. I'm very much an amateur in that regard. And this isn't really a book about moths. It's actually a book about sort of general rules of nature, just illuminated by specific animals, and those animals are moths. So each chapter takes a species and then uses that to illustrate some of the basic ecological principles that build up over the course of 7 or 8 chapters to hopefully giving an insight into how nature is structured and is diversity is produced. So I start with this moth. This is actually a moth that I caught the very first night that I ran my moth trap in London. Now, those of you that know moths will know that moths are Lepidoptera. So that scientific name comes from the Latin for scaled wings. And the reason why we have moths of such incredible sort of colors and patterns and beauty is because of these scales on their wings. However, those scales can get rubbed off, and that's very much the case with this individual. It's lost most of its scales, revealing the sort of hard, sort of chitinous sort of wing sheets and the exoskeleton of its body, sort of showing that it's an insect like any other once it's stripped of its scaly finery. But the fact that it's lost its scales means that it's also quite hard to identify. However, this particular moth was identifiable largely because of these fantastic feathery antennae. And here is an individual in slightly better condition, also from the roof terrace here, and it's a gypsy moth. Now, gypsy moth is interesting in many different ways that I don't really have time to go into here, but one thing it does illustrate is life's superpower. And the superpower of life is its ability to replicate itself, to reproduce. And the gypsy moth really illustrates that incredibly. But life's superpower really is very impressive. So sort of the first organisms probably reproduce themselves simply by sort of splitting in two. So those early organisms would have been single cells, and then they would have split and divided to make 2 individuals. Each one of those cells could also have divided to form 2 more individuals, and that process would eventually lead to populations growing. But the power of this process is really quite incredible. So a simple doubling of individuals like this can very rapidly lead to very large populations. So an appropriate illustration, since we're sort of deep into for the international football competition at the moment. This is an example given by a colleague of mine, David Colquhoun, on his website, DC Science. And he uses the example of a dripping tap. So he imagines that a football match kicks off at Wembley here, and as it does, a drop of water drips out of a tap. However, the leak starts to grow, and after a minute, 2 drops of water come out of the tap. Then after 2 minutes, 4 drops, 3 minutes, 8 drops, and so on. And David says, how long would it take for Wembley Stadium to overflow with water if the water continued to drip out of the tap at a doubling rate like that? And the answer is actually before half time in the match. So it would take just 44 minutes for a dripping tap where the number of drips doubled every minute to completely fill this stadium. And it's this sort of ability for populations to grow that got the medics and the government very worried during the COVID pandemic, because populations don't have to double at every time step, as it were, for populations to grow very rapidly. So here we just have a graph of how a population would grow if it started out with just 10 individuals, and it grew through 50 time steps, where it's just adding sort of an extra 5% of individuals to the population. So it's not doubling, it's not 100% addition every time step, it's just 5%. And you can see that it only takes sort of fewer than 50 time steps for the population to grow to be more than 1,000 individuals. And the rate of growth just gets faster and faster as you get more and more individuals in the population. So as long as there are more deaths, as long as there are more births happening in a population in any given time than there are deaths, then the population will increase in size. And this was beautifully illustrated by the gypsy moth. So this is Leopold Trouvelot. He was a French scientist working in the United States in the 19th century. Maria Popova says that he remains best known for his exquisite astronomical illustrations. He was something of a scientific polymath. I would argue that he actually remains best known for the fact that because he was interested in silk production, he imported some gypsy moths from Europe into the United States. The aim was that he would try and get them to reproduce there in his house and hopefully use them to produce silk. However, in 1868 or 1869, we're not exactly sure when, some of the gypsy moths escaped from his house. I think we're not exactly sure how it happened. Some caterpillars probably fell out of his window or something. This was at 27 Myrtle Street in Medford in Massachusetts. And this is a picture of his house. So Trouvelot realized that this could be problematic, and he did inform the authorities, although again, we don't exactly know what that means. He did eventually move on. But after about 20 years, or 20 years after these caterpillars got out, then the locals started noticing that there were rather a lot of gypsy moths and their caterpillars in Medford. And we actually have testimony from people who lived in the town. So, for example, Mrs. Follansby, the walks, trees and fences in my yard and the sides of the house were covered with caterpillars. I used to sweep them off with a broom and burn them with kerosene, and in half an hour they would be just as bad as ever. There were literally pecks of them. So a peck is about 9 litres. There was not a leaf on my trees. One of her neighbours, Mrs. Snowden. I've seen the end of Mrs. Spinney's house so black with caterpillars that you could have hardly told what colour the paint was. And Mrs. Ransom, in the evening we could hear the caterpillars eating in the trees. It sounded like the clipping of scissors. Literally, these caterpillars chewing would keep people awake at night, and you couldn't hang out washing in the gardens because it would just become covered in caterpillar frass. So this was an incredible population explosion, and it sort of it stimulated the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to try and eradicate this insect. So they sprayed the environment around Medford with Paris green, which is a very toxic chemical. Here are some men that they've employed to try and clear this particular tree, of egg masses. But of course, by the time that the people of Medford noticed what was going on, it was too late to control them. The worms were out of the can, so to speak. And the gypsy moth in the US now occupies more than 1 million square kilometre in northeast North America, so New England up into Canada. And it's not super abundant every year, but it has outbreak years. And so, for example, in 1990, which was one of those outbreak years, it defoliated, the caterpillars defoliated almost 3 million hectares of forest, which has significant impacts on the sort of forestry and the economy of these areas. So it just goes to show that as long as births exceed deaths, even by just a little amount, a population can grow and explode and have quite devastating consequences. And it very well illustrates this quote from Samuel Butler, which all progress is based upon a universal innate desire on the part of every organism to live beyond its income. Something perhaps we can all relate to. Anyway, of course, although all organisms would like to live beyond their incomes, no organism can. No population increases forever. Eventually, something happens to bring it under control. Eventually, the death rate catches up with the birth rate and population stops growing. And of course, there's various ways in which that can happen. So one way is that a species don't live in isolation, and there are other species that are competing with them for the resources that they need. So all organisms essentially have to take in material, nutrients, and energy to allow them to grow and reproduce and their populations to grow. Sometimes we see that those resources, the availability of those resources improves, and that has knock-on effects. So one lovely example is this moth species. It's a dingy footman. Footman caterpillars like lichens, and with the Clean Air Act in the UK and across Europe, lichen populations have recovered from the sort of the acid rain days of the 60s and 70s. And so too have the populations of the caterpillars and the moths that feed on them. So the dingy footman in the UK has increased more than 6,500% in abundance since the 1970s off the back of this fantastic availability of food. But equally, food is a limiting resource. So, we live on a finite planet, resources are finite. And when there are more than one species competing for them, that means that the populations of those species eventually run out of food and stop growing. So there's some lovely work been done on moths feeding on this food plant. This is an oak tree, this one on Hampstead Heath. And a couple of the moth species that feed on it, so the winter moth and the green tortrix. So the caterpillars of these two moths can completely defoliate oak trees. Even in sort of standard years, the caterpillars of these two moths will consume about 40% of the leaves that an oak tree produces. And it's been estimated that if these moths didn't exist, then a tree could, in a normal year, put on about 60% more wood than it actually can when these species are there. So even when resources seem to be, essentially unlimited, like the leaves on an oak tree, still they can be, and that can then lead to populations competing with each other, and for that reason, stopping increasing or even crashing and collapsing. Another way in which population growth can be brought under control is because animals don't only eat plants, some animals eat other animals. As I said, sort of 1 in 9 species is a moth, and that means that moths are fundamental to many food chains on the planet. What that means is that there's lots of species out there that are out to get moths. So I sort of illustrate this through the example of the oak egger. This is a nice example of an ecological prediction that came true. I predicted that I was going to catch an oak egger in the next few days at this particular site. And the reason I predicted that is because the moth trap doesn't only attract moths, but actually it attracts some of the creatures that like to eat moths. So, for example, it regularly attracts yellow jacket wasps like this one here that buzzed in one morning when I was trapping on the terrace and grabbed this box tree moth and proceeded to paralyze it, bite off its wings and legs, and carry away its torso. But it also attracts species like this. This is a parasitoid wasp, Enicospilus inflexosus. And this is when I knew that there must be oak eggers where I was trapping, because this parasitoid is a specialist on oak eggers. The caterpillar. So this insect lays its eggs inside an oak egger caterpillar. They then hatch out and eat the caterpillar from the inside, as in Alien, if you're aware of that film. That's the sort of process. But parasitoid wasps are actually probably one of the least known elements of insect diversity. So there are around 95,000 described species of parasitoid, but where it's been studied, essentially it's been found that there's roughly one specialist parasitoid for every sort of insect species in specific groups, which suggests that every other insect species is probably a parasitoid. So given that we know almost 1 million insect species, probably maybe a 1 million species of parasitoid out there. And there are even parasitoids of parasitoids. So the fact that we know 95,000 species, probably that's a huge underestimate of the number that the species that are actually out there. Of course, it's not only insects that consume moths. Many vertebrates do, bats and birds. So birds, just for great tits and blue tits, we can estimate at this time of year, sort of the height of the breeding season, when the days are long and parents are feeding large broods, more than 2 billion caterpillars per day are being consumed just by great tits and blue tits, just by 2 of the bird species in the UK. Sort of Darwin realized, that when we behold the face of nature, we essentially forget that we're seeing creatures that are spending all their lives destroying life, insects and seeds and so on. And so predators are one of the key ways in which population growth is controlled in some species, but also that it basically imposes processes that then drive a lot of the diversity that we see in a moth trap, because how, for example, moths respond to predators, be they bats or birds or parasitoids, drives lots of the diversity and form that we see in their camouflage, their color patterns, and how they live their lives, whether they hide away or whether they consume toxins and sit out boldly, daring any organism to try and consume them. So we're sort of now essentially, chapter on chapter building up the processes, so showing how populations grow, how that leads to competition for a common resource, how predators then can potentially impose themselves and stop populations growing, and how that can start to drive the diversity of form and lifestyle. And then that is a theme that sort of carry on through the chapter on the codling moth and the goat, which explores sort of in more detail what organisms do between birth and death really affects very much the function and the form that they can express. So essentially, all organisms have to consume, they have to acquire resources, nutrients and energy, and they need to do that so they can grow, they can survive, and they can reproduce. But all organisms have their own idiosyncratic ways in which they allocate that energy to growth and survival and reproduction. And moths are no different. So here we have 2 species that, at first glance look very similar. This is a codling moth. It's a little moth. If you've ever bitten into an apple and you found half a caterpillar in that apple, then you've just consumed probably the other half of a codling moth caterpillar. So this is a species that has to get through its life cycle very quickly. So that means it doesn't grow very big. And when it does reach adulthood, it doesn't have the capacity to lay very many eggs. On the other hand, here we have the goat moth. This is possibly the favorite moth I've ever caught in a moth trap. This is a real standout in the UK. So this is a species that its caterpillars live in the heartwood of trees. It's a relatively safe environment, so that means that they're not concerned about having to rush through their life cycle. So the caterpillars can take sort of 4 or 5 years in the heartwood of a tree growing to become an adult moth. And the result is a very big animal that can potentially lay lots of eggs. But all organisms have to work out how they're going to allocate the energy that they can consume to growth, reproduction, and survival, and all organisms do it differently. I would just point out that so for a human, so for example, my daughter, who was 3 kilos when she was born, she might increase in size, 15 or 20 times between birth and adulthood. For some moths, from egg to a full-size caterpillar, they can increase their body mass 30,000 times, which is the equivalent of my daughter growing from her birth size to be the size of a humpback whale. Moths are incredible creatures. So as I said, no organism lives in isolation. And one of the most complicated things to understand is how they get together and survive together in communities. So for much of the history of ecological science, we've sort of taken the view that ecological communities are rather ordered systems. So I always use the analogy of, like the Edwardian village idyll as typified by this verse from All Creatures Great and Small, the rich man in his castle and the poor man at his gate. So every species has its place in a community in a sort of structured, ordered way. But that's a model that is kind of difficult to square with what we actually see in nature. So we see things like this. So here we have a species of moth, the uncertain, and here we have another species of moth, the rustic. So these are 2 species that look very similar. They're very difficult to tell apart. Their caterpillars eat the same thing. They fly at the same time of year. They have essentially the same sort of life strategy from year to year. And yet these 2 species can occur side by side in the same communities. How is that even possible? How is it possible that 2 things that can do exactly the same thing can persist together? And now in the UK, we have this species as well. This is Vine's rustic, which has spread in over the past few decades, which essentially does the same thing as these other 2. And again, is very similar to those species, a bit of an identification headache when you catch them in the trap. And increasingly, we've come to realize that actually what goes on in the village, what goes on in the ecological community, doesn't happen in isolation from the wider environment. So the structure of ecological communities is driven not only by what the species do, but also by what's in the surrounding area and what opportunities that has for species to come in and colonize and leave and so on. And these sort of random processes of arrival and departure actually are a fundamental process that structures communities and potentially allows very similar species or species doing very similar things to coexist in the environment. So what that realization that what goes on beyond communities really matters means is that then you have to think about movement of individuals around the environment. So when ecologists talk about migration, they can mean all sorts of different things. They can mean, the migration of individuals up and down the water column or up and down a beach as the tide advances and retreats. We tend to think of migration in its most spectacular manifestation, which is long distance migration. We often think about that in terms of birds, but actually insects are spectacular long distance migrants, and it's typified in this chapter by the silver Y. So again, appropriate given that we're in the Euros. So I don't know if any of you remember the final of the European Football Championship in 2016, Portugal against France, when the stadium organisers had left the lights on in the Stade de France overnight, just coinciding with a big movement of silver Y moths across the continent. And the stadium then for that football match was heaving with these moths. One even sat on Ronaldo's forehead here as he was waiting to be substituted after becoming injured. But silver Ys are just an incredible organism. So they weigh little more than a large raindrop. They can cruise at 40 to 50 kilometers an hour. Heading south in the autumn, they can cover more than 600 kilometers in a night, and perhaps 700 million of them might cross the channel in an autumn migration season. It's quite remarkable. And they're not the only species as well. There are trillions of insects in the skies above us moving around, and lots and lots of migratory moth species. Here's just a selection of migrants that I caught on Blakeney Point last October. All of these are species that would have been migrating up from the continent. And migrants are really important because they can rescue populations that otherwise wouldn't be able to survive in areas where the birth rate doesn't exceed the death rate. And also they enrich communities, so they add species in because local communities can be enriched by species coming in from the surrounding area. So migrants really matter. Movement is not a luxury, or travel is not a luxury. It's an absolute essential for the natural world. What that means is that obviously we have to understand the structure or how we get lots of other species in the surrounding environment to essentially come and enrich communities. And that means we have to think about the birth and death of species. So for moths, this is a process that's been going on perhaps 300 million years as moths have been diversifying. And what we know is that where there's been lots of time for diversification, where there's been lots of area, where there's been lots of resources through energy, all of those things give the raw materials for life to diversify and for lots of species to exist. Why we have more species in the tropics than in the temperate zone. And then finally, of course, we can't have any consideration of the natural world now without thinking about the impact of humans on it through driving species extinct, like this stout dart, a British species that's gone extinct, or the box tree moth that you'll be familiar with, a species that has been moved to the UK by human activity. Human activity is probably driving large-scale declines in insects. Moths are one of the groups that we know best, and so we can see that decline best. And we know that since 1970, we've probably lost about a third of all our moth individuals across the UK. And it's not like the 1970s was a high point in moth abundance. So we are really having a significant impact on the natural world, and looking at moths, thinking about moths helps us to realize this and to understand it. And then I just finish by thinking a little bit about the future. All of this work on moths, helps us to understand the natural world, but as I said at the start, most species out there, we don't even know that they exist. And that's even the case in the UK. So here is a species of moth I caught on my roof terrace, which wasn't even a known species when I started moth trapping. It's a thing called the Acer sober, and it was only formally identified by science in 2017. And yet it's something that I catch in London and comes to the moth trap in London. There's even a species of moth that was first described to science from individuals collected on Hampstead Heath. So, what's incredible is that all of us, everyone, everywhere has these sorts of organisms, these species living around us, and they're beautiful, and there's so much more to learn about them. They've inspired me to think about how the natural world works, and I hope that through this book and through this talk, I might sort of help pass on some of that inspiration to you. Moths are fantastic, and I would encourage everyone to go and look at them if they can. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that, Tim. I thought that was, I'm just going to stop the recording before we do a go on to questions.